Now, today we're going to begin a new book of the Torah, and Mort raised a question this morning that I thought was worth actually beginning with. So we're going to be on page 317, which is the beginning of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. So Mort, who studies in numbers of different places, asked the question, in one of the other chumashim, in one of the other editions of the Bible, of the Torah, the translation's different. It appears to be that the Torah is different. So the Torah is not different. The text of the Torah you'll find in the Art Scroll or in the Reform movements, the UAHC or URJ Chumash or this Chumash. The text of the Hebrew is the same. Okay? The question is translation. How do you translate? And that is a very technical, interesting question. First of all, do you translate literally? And is there any such thing as translating literally? When I translate a word, because in different languages, different words carry different associations. They cover different linguistic territory. So when I'm translating, all translation is ultimately an act of interpretation. All translation is ultimately an act of judgment of what the word can mean, what it's supposed to mean. And when you get into the question of what does the word supposed to mean? And how do I turn these words that are literally one thing in one language into a meaningful sentence or a meaningful paragraph in another language? You end up with interpretation, not simply with literal translation. Which is one of the reasons why, as we study here, you'll notice that occasionally I'll ask you to turn over to the Hebrew and look at the Hebrew, because I think that there are nuances in the Hebrew that don't emerge from the translation. Now, in particular, Mort was mentioning the Art Scroll Chumash. Art Scroll is a modern Orthodox publishing house in New York that does a lovely series of books, all kinds of Jewish books, prayer books and Bible books and Talmud and lots of other things. And they have a point of view. I mean, they have a very distinct point of view. An Orthodox rabbi would tell you that when Moses ascended Mount Sinai, he was given not one but two Torahs. The Torah Shebichtav, the written Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses that we possess, and then Torah Sheba'al Peh, which means the interpretation that would later emerge and later be discovered and promulgated by the rabbis of the Talmud. Now, if you believe that Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the Talmudic interpreted tradition, is on the equal footing of Torah Shebichtav, which is on equal footing of the writing that you find in the Torah itself, then you're going to use the interpretations that are offered by the Talmudic tradition in order to translate the Hebrew into the English. And you're going to find those interpretations, they're going to find their way into the translation. Sometimes that happens unconsciously, because the people who are translating are so immersed in that literature, they can't free themselves from that. And often it happens on purpose, because it's part of the polemic. It's part of it's part of their point of view to say that the Talmudic tradition is on the equal footing with the written, equally authoritative as the written tradition of the Torah, and so they're going to bring that in, and that's a natural thing. It happens all the time when you translate. You bring it in, whether you're doing it consciously or unconsciously, and that's why the translations are going to differ. Let's take an example from a very different tradition for a moment, if that's okay. If you ever open a Christian Bible, if you want to see the same process working outside of the Jewish tradition, open a Christian Bible, which means check yourself into a cheap hotel and open the top drawer of the nightstand, and you'll find a Bible there with a cross on it. It says Holy Bible, donated by the Gideon Society. Lovely people go around putting Bibles in hotel rooms. And you'll notice, if you know the Hebrew Bible and you know how it's translated in a chumash like this one, and you compare it to the Christian Bible, you'll find that in certain key places, certain words are different. And the reason there is exactly the same reason. Because what the Christian translators were trying to do was to read back the Christian story back into the Jewish Bible. And so when they reach certain key passages, which are germane, which are important, they're pillars of the Christian story, they're going to reread the Hebrew Bible in that way, and they're going to add those translations in that way. We all do this all the time. So that's the reason why the translations are the most famous one, of course, is that in the book of Matthew, which is the first of the 4 Gospels, he tells the Christmas story, okay? And in the opening of the Christmas story, it says that this fellow Joseph is engaged to marry this woman Mary, Joseph and Miriam. They're supposed to get married. And when Joseph came to marry his wife, he found that she was pregnant, okay? And he was about to divorce her quietly because he was a good guy. But the voice of the Holy Spirit comes to him and says that the child that is to be born of the Holy Spirit. Don't divorce your wife. And so Joseph marries her anyway. And the next thing that the book of Matthew does is quote a verse from Isaiah. Now, the idea that Matthew's quoting a verse from Isaiah tells you that Matthew, number one, is writing for a Jewish audience that goes to shul and knows that that's the Haftorah, right? Because otherwise quoting the verse makes no sense. He quotes the verse, and it's a verse from a story way back 700 years before Jesus is born. And it's a story about a king named Achaz, who is being pressured to join a military alliance against the Assyrian Empire. And in the pressure, the prophet says, don't join the military alliance. And the king says, how do I know I won't get crushed? And the prophet says, because there's a young woman who's going to give birth to a baby, and she's going to call that baby Emmanuel, which means God is with us. And that's the sign that you'll know that you shouldn't join this alliance. And before that kid is grown up, you will know that you will prosper, I promise you. Now, in that story in Isaiah, it's just a young woman, and it has to be a young woman that he's familiar with. So most commentators assume that the prophet is talking about the king's daughter. But when the Christian tradition wanted to establish this notion of virgin birth, they took the Hebrew word alma, which means a young woman, and they translated it as virgin, which is betulah, which is a different Hebrew word, right? But you see, it fit the Christian myth to translate the word differently. That's what I mean when we use, does that make some sense? Right? That's when we're using translation differently. So some of you were with me a couple of weeks ago, and we sort of studied that story together. Because from a Jewish standpoint, the story reads very differently than from a Christian standpoint. From a Christian standpoint, that's the story of the virgin birth of the Son of God, which makes a lot of sense in the Christian story. But Matthew isn't writing a Christian story. Matthew's writing a Jewish story. Matthew is Jewish. Matthew's talking to Jews, about Judaism. And he didn't mean it to be a Christian story. Virgin birth is not a concept that Matthew knows anything about. Matthew does know, however, how girls get pregnant. I assume he does, right? And the story there is that Joseph has every right to castigate this girl, to throw her out, to shame her, even to have her stoned by the court because she's committed an act of adultery. She's engaged in sexual contact before they were married. But instead, he marries her and adopts the kid as his own. There's a technical word for this in Christian faith. It's called menschlichkeit, right? Rachmanis epis, right? The notion that Jesus is born out of a tremendous act of Rachmanis makes sense for a Jewish audience. The Christian audience had to translate that into a virgin birth, which made sense for a Christian audience raised on Greek and Roman myths. And that's the difference. And there, too, the word is different. Does that make some sense? That's a long answer to a very good question. You're welcome, and Merry Christmas to you. So anyway, Happy New Year. That they came later. And by then already, they're married, So they're half-brothers or whatever, never. No, the idea that a guy marries a girl who's pregnant with somebody else's kid and raises that kid as his own, that's called menschlichkeit. And the idea that there's a forgiveness in that is going to fit the later character of what Jesus' message is going to be, which is forgiveness. I could give a great Christmas sermon. No one's ever asked me. Mark, have you ever given a Christmas sermon? Yeah, see? This is my friend Rabbi Gelman. So every rabbi wants to give a Christmas sermon because everyone inside, we say, we so much fun to do this, right? Yom Kippur, yeah, it's like pulling teeth to give a Yom Kippur. People are hungry and the liturgy is stiff. Christmas, my God. Anyway, so one year I think I'm going to switch sides just to try it. What? Give it here, right. I was listening on the radio once. I was on the radio once, and there was a call-in show to, like, minister, rabbi, priest, and somebody calls in and says, my kid really believes in Santa Claus, and I'm really afraid that one day she's going to discover that Santa Claus isn't real. What should I do? And that was so sweet. And the person was very honest, and very, calling from Iowa or someplace, right? We shouldn't rub it into Iowa because they lost yesterday, but, so they, badly. I feel like what would Rabbi Schulweis? Rabbi Schulweis would talk about the Santa Claus within, right? I feel like Schulweis would have made such a great preacher, You could have said the Santa Claus who's inside of all of us, that's where Santa Claus lives. Yeah, Marty, someone had a hand up. Marty. No, it was written in Greek. It's a Greek-speaking community. I don't know, but you see, then you'd have to look up the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation. So assuming that Matthew doesn't know, the question is, does Matthew know Torah in Hebrew or does Matthew know Torah in Greek? And now you're outside of my expertise. But the idea that he's quoting it already tells you who he's talking to. If he was talking to a Gentile Greek audience, you don't quote Bible verses, you quote other stuff. But if you're talking to Jews, and he only quotes a little bit of the verse, which means he assumes that you go to shul and that you're awake during the Haftorah, and that you know that verse, and that you know the whole context. I mean, it's very clear that he's writing for a Jewish audience. And what Matthew was trying to do, this is out of our topic, but what Matthew was trying to do, he lives about 125, 130. What he's trying to do is the same thing as the rabbis are trying to do at the same time. The temple has been destroyed. We've lost the Bar Kokhba revolt. There's a tremendous sense of spiritual disillusionment within the Jewish people. What is going to be the new core of Jewish faith? What does Jewish look like after this series of catastrophes? The rabbis are going to create the rabbinic tradition, and they're going to build a rabbinic tradition that's going to replace the temple. I mean, if you want to use a little an acronym for it, you understand they're going to replace Beit Mikdash with Beit Midrash. That school and Torah study is going to be the new core of Jewish life, no longer temple in Jerusalem. Matthew has a different strategy. Somebody hands Matthew a scrapbook of the life and teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. And he becomes very excited by this. And he realizes that he adopts a thesis, a theory. It's a really interesting theory. Suppose the Messiah came and we killed him. Suppose the world was as bad as it could get under the Romans, and God sent the Messiah to save us. And he got killed before he could finish his work. What would the world look like now? And that's Matthew's thesis, and that's what he writes in the gospel. You see? So he's trying to do the same thing the rabbis are doing, only he takes it in a very different direction. And that's where you get the gospel. Now, the other gospels move, especially John, and then Paul, who was a contemporary. Jesus is going to move Christianity in a very different direction. But Matthew, I read as a brother. I mean, Matthew's a very Jewish book. I had this idea once of quoting him in shul. Just saying, a great teacher once said, you guys wouldn't know who he was. It sounds Hasidic sometimes, Because he says it's not enough simply to do a mitzvah. You have to ask yourself, what internal transformation is this mitzvah trying to accomplish? That's a very Hasidic idea. Only Matthew had it, before the Hasidim got to it. It's very interesting. If the Lubavitcher Rebbe knew that he was quoting Matthew, never mind. I won't finish that sentence. All right, we'll stop there. All right, good question. Any other questions? All right, so today we're on 317. New book of the Bible. New narrative altogether. Okay, we good? So you take a look at the beginning. Eilish Shemot B'nai Yisrael. These are the names of B'nai Yisrael. Haba'im Mitzrayim et Yaakov Ishu Beito Ba'u. These are the names of all of them who came down. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun, Binyamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. Kol Nefesh. Everybody who came out of Jacob was 70 people. Joseph already in Egypt. Joseph died and his brothers and all that generation. Period. That's the end of Genesis. That's the recap in the end of Genesis. The family narrative is now over. We are now going to move from the family narrative to the national narrative. From the narrative of who we are as a family and where we came from to a national narrative. Now, the book is called Shemot, names. Hebrew books, Bible books, get their name from the first significant word in the first line of the book. So Breshit, Genesis, is the name of Breshit. It's the first word in the book. Shemot, Ve'elu Shemot, the second word in the book. Vayikra, we call it Leviticus, right? It's actually Vayikra. God called to him from Moshe. The third one is Bamidbar, in the wilderness. The fifth book is Devarim, Ve'ela HaDvarim. Somehow, however, those names actually fit. It's an irony, but the names happen to fit. Breshit, in the beginning, is about our beginnings, the beginning of the world, the beginning of humankind. The foundations of all of Jewish faith are in the book of Breshit. Shemot, names. This is a book about our collective identity. Who are we? What are the narratives, the stories that shape us? What are the core values that shape us? I can tell you that we are a family, that we have blood ties, but there's more than that that shapes us, more than that that we have in common. Shemot is a book of identity, and it's going to be wrestling through most of the book with this question of who we are, and what does it mean to be who we are. Now just stop for a moment and step back with me for a second. We tell stories. Human beings tell stories. Rabbi Gelman is one of the great storytellers of the generation. We tell stories. Why do we tell stories? I'll tell you, by the way, telling stories is a natural human thing. We've been doing it since there have been human beings. Telling stories is not just for little children. As a rabbi, I will tell you that when I tell a story in a sermon, people pay attention. And when I finish the story and I give you the moral of the story and I move from narrative, storytelling, to discursive talk, just telling you stuff, you don't pay attention nearly as much. So they teach you in rabbi school, every few minutes, tell them another story. Because as soon as you tell them a story, as soon as you say to people, it's like that time and you start to tell the story, the attention level goes up. We connect with story. Now, what does story do? On one level, story is the way that human beings share experiences. You weren't there when I was there, but if I tell you the story, now you're there with me, and vice versa. We can enter into each other's experiences by sharing stories together. If I were to ask you to turn to the people sitting next to you and say hello to them and tell them what you did New Year's Eve, you'd all start telling stories. If I were to tell you to turn to the people next to you and talk about how you got here today, what were the forces that shaped you as a human being that brought you to synagogue the day after New Year's? And you would begin telling stories. You would tell stories about grandparents and parents and experiences of faith and of coming to shul and what shul means. I mean, you'd have all kinds of stories to tell. It's not so much that we tell stories in some very deep way. We are our stories. What makes us us are the stories that we harbor, that we share. Stories can create connections among people. When we share a story, families have family stories. You ever sat at somebody's family table and they start telling their family stories? Oh, that's like that camping trip in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Oh, yeah. Now you feel silly because you weren't there. But when they tell the story, you realize that this was a shaping experience that they all shared together. Parents tell and grandparents tell their stories to children, so that children have some sense of who are these people who brought me into the world and how did I get here? And who am I? So stories can unite us into collectivities, into families, into communities, into nations. Nations have stories. In fact, this nation has some of the greatest stories because unlike other nations, we don't share a common language. We speak English and Spanish and Korean and Cambodian and 100 other things. Just go into LA and see, right? We don't share, we haven't been living in this continent very long. We all came from someplace else, much to the chagrin of some of the presidential candidates. And we haven't been here very long, but coming to this country, we adopt its stories. America is really an expression of its stories. We share common stories. And if you look at the great stories of American culture, you understand how story is what culture is. Culture is that which tells us who we are, where we are in the world, and what we can expect of the world, what we can expect of each other. And that's communicated to each other by stories. So we tell stories to express who we are and where we come and what we expect of each other. If you want to know what the great American stories are, look at the holidays we celebrate. Thanksgiving is a great American story. The 4th of July is a great American story. Even better than that, every culture has a mode and method of telling its national stories. Right? For Judaism, it's Torah reading. That's how we share our myths, our stories. For America, it's movies. We tell our stories through the great movies. Think of the great movies and then take away the details of the movie and you end up with one of the great core cultural stories of America. You're making a face at me.
What would you say is the greatest?
Give me one.
Citizen Kane.
Citizen Kane. What's the story of Citizen Kane? Is a great story. But it's not so much an American as a Greek story, right? It's about hubris, right? About a man who overreaches. It's also about a man who violates, who thinks that he can control the polity. He doesn't believe in democracy, which is the wisdom of the community. He wants to shape the community. He wants to manipulate the community for his own gain. And what ends up happening? He destroys himself, right? Give me another one. Animal House. What is Animal House about? This is a very important. Animal House is about Even Masu Habonim Hayta L'Rosh Pina. The stone that was rejected by the builders turns out to be the cornerstone of all. The rejects, the screw-ups, the weirdos, the nerds, the ones who are, I get it mixed up with Revenge of the Nerds because they all, those who were pushed out turn out to be the stars of the story. Look, who is America? Do you think that the leading aristocracy of Boston were the ones who supported George Washington? See, today we call them patriots. Then they called them traitors. Right? They were the people who fought for America were the rejects. They were the Animal House. They were the screw-ups. Right? Washington was the best among them. Washington and Jefferson. The rest of them were all a bunch of schleppers. Right? Sorry, what? Who came here? Right. Right. Now, see, that's one of the great ironies of American Jewish history. Ask an American Jew, who was your great-grandfather? Oh, my great-grandfather was a very learned, pious, Orthodox rabbi. Everybody's grandparent was a learned, pious, Orthodox rabbi, except ours. Our family, we were horse thieves. Card players, pickpockets, prostitutes. The great, pious, learned rabbis stayed in Europe because America was a wasteland. Your grandfather was a bad plumber. Your grandfather was a crook. They're the ones who came. They sent the schleppers to America, right? Remember the Frisco Kid? There's a great American movie, right? The kid who, at the end of the bench got sent to America, right? So America, I haven't seen the new Star Wars movie, so don't give it away to me yet. I'm the only one in America. I'm proud that I haven't seen it yet. But me either. Well, there you go. Culturally illiterate. But if you remember, Star Wars, George Lucas actually knew a lot of mythology when he created Star Wars, right? Because the whole idea that, the young hero, Luke Skywalker, light, fighting against the faceless Empire. Everybody in the Empire has no face, right? Including Darth Vader, the Dark Father, right? I mean, this kind of stuff. This is all mythological. This is all story. We use stories to legitimate leadership. We use stories to establish community. This story is asking the following question: who are we to each other? So look at the first answer. Who are we to each other? It says, all the people who went down to Egypt, all of the children of Jacob, were 70 in number. And then they list Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun, Binyamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. If you're an ancient Israelite, what are those? Those are tribes. If I tell you a story about my Uncle Sam and his 50 children, Arizona, Alabama, Connecticut, California, Kansas, Arkansas, you say, oh, I get it. What are we to each other? According to this line, according to this paragraph, what are we to each other? We are one extended family. We are mishpacha. There is a blood tie among us. We are B'nai Yisrael, the children of a fellow named Israel. We are blood to each other. We're family. What is the advantage or the strength of a family tie? There was a poet who once said, when family is the only place in the world when you show up, they have to let you in. except for some families. Family means you always have a place at the table no matter who you are. But there's a disadvantage to family. What's the problem with calling us a family? You can't join. You'll always be a son-in-law. You'll always be someone on the outside. So that's not enough for the Torah. Look at the next line. Vayamot Yosef. Joseph died and all his brother in that generation. And now, U'bnei Yisrael paru v'yishritzu v'yirbu v'yatzmu ma'od ma'od. Bnei Yisrael, it's verse 7. Now, the top of page 318. The people Israel, paru v'yishritzu v'yirbu. Those Hebrew words, pru or revu. V'yishrotz et ha'aretz. What is pru or revu? Be fruitful and multiply. Where does that language come from? Genesis. So the guy who wrote Shemot knew Genesis. The guy who wrote this story down knew Genesis, and he's mimicking the language of Genesis. He's mimicking Genesis. When God creates life on the planet, paru v'urevu, it fills the world, v'yishritzu, and it covers the land. He's using the language of enormous fertility, an explosion of fertility that you get from Genesis, from the creation of the world, to talk about the creation of this people. What's ironic is what? This was what was promised to Abraham, except where was it supposed to take place? In Canaan. And where is it taking place? In Egypt. Don't it always go that way? You get half the blessing, right? V'yirbu v'yatzmu. They became more and they became powerful. B'me'od me'od. That's a very strange elocution. Me'od means very. Me'od me'od? B'me'od. Even, it's a very veryness. You can't imagine. I mean, everywhere you go, there are Jews. I mean, underfoot everywhere, right? V'timaleh ha'aretz otam. And the land filled with them. Okay? And now we begin a new chapter. Billy. Hopefully you share the common story, right? It means that if I live in Benjamin, which is in this, or Judah, which is in the south of Israel, and the people in Naphtali, which is in the north of Israel, need my help, they can call upon me because we're family. We're not members of simply a tribe. There's a collectivity there. There's a connection among us. But the Torah is not satisfied with that. There's something else that has to happen to us before we become a true collectivity. And that is a common experience. What experience is it that's going to shape us? Now, this is a very strange story in the context of ancient literature, because most of the time when you have an experience that shapes you, it's a revelatory experience. It's an elevating experience. You would not have expected a story to say the founding experience of our people is a story of degradation. You would not have expected that. Right? It's a very rare story of a degradation story, right? Usually you want an uplifting kind of story. But this is going to be a different kind of story. That's what it's trying to tell you at the beginning. This is not a normal birth narrative of a people. Okay? We are not born of the gods. On the contrary, where are we born? In slavery, of the lowest of the lowest of the low. Right? A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Politically, what happened is another kingdom. The Israelites were living in Egypt when the Hittites ran Egypt. When the Hittites were thrown out by the locals, by the local Egyptians, that king resented Joseph, not just didn't know him. And he said to his people, this is one of the great lines, Vayomer al amo, he says to his people, Hinei am b'nei Yisrael rava atzum mimenu. The people of Israel are too, no, rava atzum can either mean too many or too strong for us. Mort, there's your translation. Hava nitchak malo. Let's be smart about this. Now, if you have a population and you want to limit them, how do you do it? Well, you could sterilize them. That's one part. But you see something. Now, where are the Israelites living? The Israelites living in among the Egyptians. They're part of Egyptian society. He begins by saying, they're a separate people. Right? Am b'nei Yisrael. Do you see that phrase? This is the first time we've ever been called an Am. This is the first time we've been recognized as a nation, not just as a family. This is the first time that we are recognized as a somebody. And it's out of Pharaoh's fear that he establishes a boundary between himself and that people. When a country, when a nation becomes fearful, They think in binary terms. All of us think in binary terms when we become afraid. Us, them. Our people, those people. The children of light, the children of dark. The blessed and the damned. He starts thinking binary right away. I'm Bnei Israel. They're too many for us. We can't deal with them. He establishes that binary. Now, what are you going to do? If you have an indigenous minority and you are afraid of them and you need them gone, what do you need to do? What's your problem, by the way? You have a problem. They've been living here for a very long time. They're part of us. They're married into our families. They teach in our schools. We do business together. We celebrate holidays together. We sit near each other at basketball games. What do you do? Our kids date each other. What do you do if you're Goebbels and you have an indigenous Jewish population that's been in Germany for 700 years and everyone has a Jew in their family and you have to create an us-them? What's the first thing you do? Before you separate them, before you even do that, you got to identify them. You got to identify them, those people. Now, once you identify them, now what do you do? So wait. Dehumanize. Well, before you get to dehumanize, castigate. They are the reason that you are suffering. Right? Why are the banks failing? Jew communists. Right? Why did we lose the First World War? Jew capitalists. You don't have to be consistent. You don't have to be consistent. The wonderful thing when you're castigating, you don't have to be philosophically consistent. Jews can be communists and capitalists at the same time. Bankers and commies at the same time. You castigate. All of our problems are because of them. All right, so now you castigate. What's the third step? Now, Brian, dehumanize. How do you dehumanize somebody? Before you get to that, before you get to taking, there's another step before you can do that. You got to use a metaphor that makes people see them differently than they saw them before. What metaphors did Goebbels use? Two of them. Vermin. What are vermin? Bugs, rats. You have pests in your house. If you have pests in your house, who do you call? An exterminator to get rid of the pests. Right? And then after pests, what was the other metaphor that he used? A cancer on the body politic. Use a medical metaphor. If you have a cancer, a tumor, what do you need to do? Cut it out. You need to, and it hurts, by the way, but it's the only way to save the body, is to cut out the tumor. And they start to use that language, people begin to see these people in different ways. Language has that capacity. If I tell you that the reason why you're paying so much at the gas pump is because of blue-eyed people who were stealing gasoline at night. I mean, I can give you a whole story about those blue-eyed people who raised the gas prices because they own all the gas stations. And they're the reason. It doesn't even matter, by the way, that gas prices are going down and that blue-eyed people have nothing to do with it. I could convince you of this. It's not hard to do. Okay? Now, anyone watched those football games yesterday and you see how rabid some of these fans get over a football game, you see that people like to belong to something and they like to have an opponent. It's something like deep inside of the human psychology. Okay, we've dehumanized them, we've castigated them, now separate. Jewish, put a yellow star or a pink triangle and start moving them out of the neighborhoods. And once you've separated them and isolated them, quarantined them in the medical metaphor, then what are you going to do next? Then you can begin to exterminate. Then you can begin to destroy. Because now the population looks upon them differently. There is a remarkable document that was published some many years ago. It was a speech given by Himmler to the staff of the Auschwitz concentration camp when it first opened. And he says to these people, you're going to feel sorry for the people that are here. Don't do that. These are the enemy of the state. These are the enemy of everything that you take precious. Now, it's interesting. The psychology is you have a natural human pity for people who are weaker than you, but you have to conquer that in order to serve something that's higher than you. That's what he's talking. That's what this process does. Michael.
No, I'm going to say that Goebbels is not original in his comments. He was using something that came out of the 19th century, Wagner, promulgated the idea that Jews were parasites on the German politics.
Right. It's not just Wagner. It goes back earlier than that.
Directly to that.
Right.
And he used that because he knew that people knew Wagner.
Right. And before they knew Wagner, they knew Luther. And before they knew Luther, they knew the Gospel of John. So this is a deep, Daniel Goldhagen, who is a wonderful scholar at Harvard, I think. He's written a lot about the internal culture of the German people and how the Nazis simply exploited cultural themes that were deep there. Here's Pharaoh. Ready? Let's be smart about this. Otherwise, in the event of war, they're going to join against our enemies and rise from the ground. They're a threat to us. Why? They'll fight against us. We've just regained independence from the enemy. We don't want them coming back. They are not loyal to our cause. So what's attempt number one? Set taskmasters over them to build garrison cities. Slavery as a way of population control. The problem is, you Jews are just uncanny. You're just not right. So the more they oppressed them, the more they increased and spread out, so the Egyptians came to dread them. Why did they come to dread them now? Because the population control didn't work. In fact, the opposite. The more they oppressed them, the more they increased. It became even more dangerous, right? So now they ruthlessly imposed labor. Turn the page. King of Egypt spoke to the midwives. We did this one last year, so I'm not going to spend too much time, but this was attempt number 2. What was attempt number 2? Limited genocide, get the midwives involved, but the midwives refused. We did this last year, so I'm not going to go to it. Now, number 3, look at verse 22 on page 321. Then Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every boy that is born you will throw to the Nile, but every girl live. More general genocide. Now, the story switches from the macro to the micro. We're going to go from the macro story of a nation at war with its indigenous minority to one family. A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. Why is that important? Why tell us that? What was extraordinary about that act? A Jewish boy committed. That's what's extraordinary. No, I'm kidding. It's an act of hope and it's an act of resistance. It's an act of hope and it's an act of resistance. After the Holocaust, the birth rate in DP camps was astronomical. Why was the birth rate in DP camps astronomical? Because it was the only way, it was the most powerful way for the survivors to say no to the world of death that they had just emerged from. The woman conceived and she bore a son, and when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. And when she couldn't hide him any longer, she got a wicker basket. Now, wait a minute. She saw how beautiful he was. She hid him for 3 months. If he'd been a miskite, she would have turned him over to the police. I mean, what kind of mother? Every mother says the most beautiful baby in the world, right? And if you're there, you better agree with her, right? You don't say, oh, that's an ugly baby. Here's mine. Look, it's much prettier than yours. I mean, every baby looks like the Gerber box, you know? Look at the Hebrew again. Here, once again, the writer of Exodus knows Genesis. Right? Look at the word, look at verse 2. Vatara isha v'teled ben, vatera oto ki tov hu. What is ki tov? What does ki tov mean? Not just good. Where does ki tov come from? Vayar ki tov. Where do you know that language from? That's Genesis language. He's not just ki tov. He's not just like a sweet baby who knows mathematics and Japanese at birth, like every other Jewish child, right? He's ki tov. There's something cosmic in this baby. She's going to hide him. She's going to hide him. Okay? After 3 months, she can't hide him anymore. Why not? Why not? You could not. You want to be pragmatic about this. All the men in the room are going to say, because at 3 months the kid is going to cry loud and the police of Pharaoh are going to find him. All the women in the room are going to say, no. What were her nightmares? Think of that woman holding that baby to her breast for 3 months, and every time she closed her eyes and fell asleep, what was her nightmare? That the police would break down the door, grab the baby from her and kill him in front of her, and she couldn't live with that nightmare anymore. It's not that she hide the baby, 2 months, 4 months. She couldn't live with the nightmare anymore. And so she's going to give him up to the river. Now this is an Egyptian mythological theme. They're ripping off an Egyptian mythological theme that the god is born of the river. And the idea that the god is not born of the river, this is a slave child being born of the river, is a riff. It's a riff on an Egyptian mythological theme. Keep going with me. Ready? So she takes him and she puts him in a Tevat Gomer. By the way, the only place in the whole Bible where the word Teva is used, anybody happen to know? Noah's Ark. So this is this cosmic saving baby who's now put in the Teva. And he's floating down the river. And his sister stationed herself to see what would happen. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile, while her maidens walked along the Nile. She spied the basket among the reeds and sent the slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy crying. She took pity on him and said, "This must be the Hebrew child." All right, we've seen the mother, the birth mother. Let's see this mother, right? The daughter of Pharaoh comes down to bathe at the Nile. When the daughter of Pharaoh comes to bathe at the Nile, who goes with her? Everybody. Got all these maidens, these maids in waiting, right? Plus the Secret Service detail. Right? A lot of people around. And yet of all the people there, who's the only one who sees the basket? She is. Now, she sends someone to get the basket. Now, I hand you a basket with a baby inside. Do you need to take the top off the basket to know there's a baby inside? Why not? Because you'll feel him wiggling and the baby's going to be screaming. At least any baby I've ever met is going to be screaming, right? But look at the way that the sentence is structured, right? Verse 6, Vatiftach, she had to open it, Vaterehu, and she saw him. Stop. What did her father want her to see? What did her father want her to see? Not even an object. A threat, an enemy, an alien, a pestilence, right? A perversion, something horrible. That's what she's supposed to see. What does she see? Vaterehu, she saw him. Et hayeled. She saw what? A child. She sees through the screens that her father's political culture has erected. And just in case you don't think that she knows, v'hinei nar, right? V'hinei nar boche. The baby cries. Now he cries. If you read this in order, if these are the events in order, when does the baby start crying? Only after she sees him. The baby looks into the eyes of this young woman, or this woman, and then the baby begins to cry. Right? V'tachmol alav. What is tachmol? She pitied. What does that mean? Betty, what does it mean? Is sorry the word? You have a young woman. Let's imagine she's a young woman of childbearing age. And she's holding a baby. How do you feel when you hold a baby? It's not pity. Pity is when someone who's sick or broken or hurt. It's a baby number. You're holding a baby. What is that feeling of holding a baby? Yeah, Bobby. It's more than a human. It's a baby. A human being. I love you. You're a human being. There's something motherly. There's a connection you have to the baby. Now, remember, what is she supposed to feel? Vayetze, prince of Egypt, grandson of the Pharaoh. One world is the slaves. He has two mothers, Nebuch, you know. He has a birth mother and an adoptive mother. And they're both involved in his life. So he has two identities, two worlds. He belongs to the palace, he belongs to the slaves. The question is, Vayetze Elechav, he goes out to his brothers. Which ones? Who are his brothers? No, don't make an assumption. That's what the whole story is about. Remember the great Union song, Which Side Are You On, Boy? Who are your brothers? And by the way, he could make a choice, right? If he chooses the palace, what does he get? Everything. A life of ease, of luxury. He'll become an ambassador, a diplomat. If he chooses the slaves, what does he get? Misery. Vayetze Elechav. Vayar, there's that word, besivlotam. Sivlotam means, it either means suffering or it means burdens. Ami. What? I can't hear you. Corvée labor is too technical. Sivlotam. That would be Tzioni's translation, right? Right? He's a biblical scholar, and that's brilliant, right? But sivlotam means labor. It means burden. It means that which lisbol means to suffer. Now, wait a minute. The average Egyptian stands at the Getty Center looking down at Los Angeles. What does he see? Slaves working hard. What is that? What do you call that in the Wall Street Journal language? Economic productivity. A new Egypt rising from the dusts of the desert. A better Egypt for you and me. Progress. That's what the Egyptian sees. What does Moses see? Misery. He sees misery. He sees abject misery. Right? Vayar v'sivlotam. Now, one more. See, the verb, vayar, keeps coming back. Vayar, and he sees. Now, you can't see abject misery when you're looking at millions of people. So you got to look at one. The most powerful book of the Holocaust ever written is not the story, is not Raoul Hilberg's 900-page history of the Holocaust, because who can read 900 pages of Raoul Hilberg anyway? It's the Diary of Anna Frank. It's one 13-year-old girl. The one who knew this best was Steven Spielberg, right? When Oskar Schindler and his girlfriend are up frolicking, and they're liquidating the ghetto, what does he see? It's the only color in the whole movie. Yeah, the little girl in the red coat. It's hard to see suffering on the macro level. It's too general. In order to really understand suffering, you've got to see one human being suffer. The experience of Anna Frank made the Holocaust vivid to the West because the reports of 6 million was too massive to even absorb that kind of thing. Right? Right? So take a look with me now, right? Vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri me'achav. Look at that phrase very carefully. Look at that phrase carefully. It's the top of page 324, right? Vayar ish mitzri, he sees an Egyptian fellow, makeh, beating, ish ivri, a Hebrew fellow, me'achav, from one of his brethren. Now, in the Bible, every word counts for $1 million because somebody had to schlep this Bible on their back for 3,000 years. How could you have said that in an easier way? Fewer words. You could have said, Vayar mitzri makeh ivri. Right? What word is superfluous in this sentence? Me'achav we'll get to in a minute. I'm going to hold that off for a minute. Ish. And look how many times the word ish is repeated. Why do you say ish mitzri makeh ish ivri? Translate that literally, somebody. Where'd Lami go? I need Lami. Translate ish mitzri makeh ish ivri. An Egyptian man beating a Hebrew man. Now, what really is happening? It's a slave master taking care of an intransigent slave. Right? Now, a slave master taking care of an intransigent slave, how does an average Egyptian see that? What is a slave in the mind of Egypt? Not even an animal. An animal you treat with rachmanis. A slave is a quantity of labor personified, embodied. In other words, the word we use in American, is appliance. What is your appliance? Your appliance is a mechanism for producing toast or opening cans, right? Did anybody wake up this morning and ask the toaster oven if it had a good night? Did anybody go this morning and give the microwave a hug? Right? You don't do that because it's not there. It's not a sentient thing. It's only a quantity of work, right? And frankly, you don't even want the thing. You just want the cans opened, right? When you bought an electric can opener, you didn't buy an electric can opener. You bought 40,000 open cans. What is a slave? It is a quantity of work personified. It is not a human being. It is not an animal. It is simply a quantity of work. It doesn't matter. It has no feelings. It has no status. It is not something that you worry about. A taskmaster beating a slave is the equivalent of a guy changing a tire at the side of the road. It is nothing, absolutely nothing, because a slave is absolutely nothing except it's a quantity of work. But that's not what Moses sees. That's what everybody sees. That's what everybody, which means nobody sees it because it happens all the time. Nobody sees it. It happens all the time. It's a guy watering his lawn. Nobody sees it. It happens all the time, except Moses stops and sees. This theme of he stops and sees what nobody else sees is going to be his whole life. He sees. Why does he see? Because he was brought up by two women who had extraordinary eyes. And what the Torah is telling you is that to be a prophet is not something in your lips, not what you say. It's about what you see. And it's not just about prophecy. This is our identity narrative. So what does it mean to be Jewish? It means to have eyes for things that nobody else sees. What does he see? Ish Mitzri, Makeh Ish Ivri. Two human beings engaged in a transaction in which one is beating the life out of the other. No screens, no slave, taskmaster, Egyptian, Hebrew, no judgment, just two human beings one killing the other. Now, what's ironic is the word echav. Me echav, one of his brethren. How do you read that? What does me echav modify? Well, it could modify one of two things. It could be one of Moses' echav, which is to say, this is the moment that Moses chooses who he is identify with. Who does he identify with? Does he identify with the taskmaster, the beater, or does he identify with the beaten? Would you rather be a hammer or a nail? Would you rather be one of the oppressors or the oppressed? At this moment, you say me'echav means this is the moment Moses chooses sides. And what does he choose? The nail. He chooses the slave. He chooses that identity. This is the moment he comes into himself. But there's even a more interesting. What if it's the other way around? What if the word me'echav modifies ish mitzri? What Moses can see, which the Egyptian can't see, is that the Egyptian is beating a man who is his brother. And that's what sets Moses off. Right? If the Torah begins with the question, Hashomer achi anochi, right? Am I my brother's keeper? Moses says, why are you doing this to your brother? He sees the brotherhood between the connection, the common humanity between these two guys, and he can't abide this. He can't abide this. And he goes, now look at the next line, right? Vayifen kovacho. Vayar, and he sees ki ein ish. Now that's a strange phrase because we just said he saw ish, right? He looks this way and that way, and he sees ki ein ish. What is a ki ein ish? No one's around. But there's two guys in front of him. But neither one is a human being at this point. One is an animal and the other is an object. One is a killer and the other is being murdered. There's no humanity here. So the Talmud will say later in Pirkei Avot, if you find yourself in a place where ein ish, shtadel liot ish, you be the human being. He stands there and he sees ki ein ish. Now, what does he do? One way to look at this is he wants to make sure that no one's going to see what he's about to do. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's much better than that. He sees this and he's absolutely shocked. And he looks around and what does he notice? Nobody else notices. I told you my story. I used to live in New York City. Back in the old days when it took guts to live in New York City, right? And I'm walking from my apartment on 121st Street to the subway on 116th Street. And it's a snowy day. It was cold as heck. And I'm bundled up. And I walked past 100. Every block had beggars because they'd opened the mental hospital. So all the schizophrenics lived out on the street. Made it interesting to live there. So every block had, so on 117th Street, a block away from the subway stop, and they all had their own sign placed. The 117th Street beggar comes up and he says, "Hey, man, you just spare a dime for a cup of coffee?" And I'm about to give him a dime, and his eyes roll back in his head, and he keels over. I'm a Californian living temporarily in New York City, studying for the rabbinate. I begin to scream, "Help, help, this man is dying, this man is dying." I start giving him CPR. I even try to give him mouth-to-mouth, I didn't want the guy to die on me. The subway stop is a half a block up. People start coming out of the subway stop. They see me doing this. Guess what New Yorkers did? They stepped over me. I kept saying, "Somebody help me, somebody." Finally, a cop comes. Finally, a police car comes. Cop that pulls up, right? Cop comes out and says, "What are you doing?" The man needed a massage. I thought I'd help him out. I'm like, I have no words. The guy says, yeah. They call it. The ambulance comes. The guy was okay. I saved his life. He's still there. I mean, he's probably, he probably owns half of Manhattan by now. So Vayar Kovachova Einish, no one stopped. No one stopped. He sees a man whose life is being beat out of him, and no one stops. What does Moses learn at that moment? Remember, Elie Wiesel wrote a really chilling book called The Town Beyond the Wall. Anyone ever read that book? It's not as popular as Night. Not as famous as his other books, but there's this chilling book, and he talks about as the town of Siget, as the Jews of the town were being rounded up, he looked up and he sees all of the neighbors peering out of their windows, watching the Nazis take his family away to Auschwitz. And he says, I have hate for the Nazis, but I have nothing but contempt for those people, because they stood there and they watched. Right? This is Moses' moment where he realized he's learning humanity. This is his education. This is the education of a prophet. Right? And what does he learn? People can watch the most horrible evil, and it doesn't move them at all. Now Moses, let's finish. I know you want to go. Ki ein ish vayach et hamitzri. And he takes out all of his rage and his frustration, and he whacks the guy. Moses is going to have a problem. He doesn't know how to use words. He goes around whacking things. This is going to get him into trouble his whole life. That whenever he gets really frustrated, he loses his words. It's not that he has a speech impediment. That's a midrash. It's that he doesn't. When he gets upset, he doesn't have words. He's not a person who has a facility with words. He tends to hit things. It's not good. It's not a good way to have a civilization. God's going to decide that later too, right? And he hides him in the sand, right? And then the next day he goes out and he sees two Hebrews beating each other, right? Vayetze bayom hasheni v'nei shnei anashim ivrim, same word, anashim, two Hebrew men, nitzim, they're fighting with each other. And he says to them, "Why do you hit your friend?" And he says, right, lama taker re'echa. What is re'echa? Ve'ahavta re'echa kamocha, right? Why do you hit the other? Vayomer mi samcha le'ish sar v'shofet aleinu. Who died and made you king? Which is ironic. Why? Because he is the king. I mean, he's the Pharaoh's grandson. And he's going to discover now something else. He's going to discover, in this vignette, all of Moses' life is compressed. In this vignette, all of Moses' life, and the entire purpose of his life is compressed into this vignette. This is Shemot. This is the story of identity. What is going to be the aspiration of Jewish identity? you should live with the eyes of Moses. You should see the suffering of the world, and you should never allow the cultural screens of propaganda, the culture that allows that suffering to go on. You should be as disturbed by it as he is. That's who you are. But there's going to be a problem in this. And what's the problem? It's always a dialectic. The problem is going to be us. That we tend to do it to each other. And so the question is, how do you lead this people if this is what they do to each other? And how do you give them these eyes if this is their responsibility? All of Moses' life is compressed in this vignette. So let's leave it now. Let's wish everybody a happy, healthy New Year.